Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith. I will not tell you my full name this time around since I've done that several times, and I will continue to make the same joke at the top of every podcast because I can't think of another one. So today is Sunday, which means we are talking about Hyperion again, and this particular chapter was a bit of a doozy, and the more that I learn about it and the content in it, the more I like it and simultaneously hate it. Dan Simmons as an author seems to have a proclivity for kind of slipping a lot of really meaningful and profound allusion and allegory into this novel, which is not necessarily surprising because this novel is written in the same style as the Canterbury Tales, and the Canterbury Tales themselves kind of rely pretty heavily on this idea of like allegory or kind of like a similar mechanism to what you have in like a children's story where there's a decided moral to the story, but the content that Simmons is dealing with is just much more adult and profound, I guess would be the way to put it. So the last chapter was Martin Silenus' story, and when we finished off with his story, our intrepid pilgrims had entered into the stage of their journey where they were waiting on a ship to ferry them across the Sea of Grass. And the Sea of Grass on Hyperion is kind of like a large body of foliage, and this foliage is this very tightly growing tall grass that's as sharp as razor blades and has very specific predators living inside of it, so you can't traverse it except for in a boat that floats on top of it. And so they were waiting on the edge of that at the beginning of the chapter. They weren't sure if the boat was going to show up at all, and thankfully it does. And after they get on the boat, they realize that the boat is unmanned, so it is automated. One of the things that we've kind of started to notice is that this pilgrimage seems to have some sort of inevitability to it. As we've discussed before, most of the planet has been evacuated, and most of the inhabitants of it are either dead to internal conflict or living in the city of Keats, crossing their fingers that they called them hegemony seed ships, that they'll arrive in time to evacuate them out of or off of the planet before the ousters get there, because they are worried for their lives, obviously, from the ouster invasion. And so it's just a little odd that all these pieces of technology that these individuals who are completing this pilgrimage, all the pieces of technology that they're relying on seem to still work in some capacity, if not just barely. So this ship is automated, and I think it's interesting the way that Simmons describes the ship. He consistently uses this specific sound of a wheel humming, and I think that there's a lot of subtle things and references to cyclical things in this book. Things seem to kind of always like go around and come back and maybe not exist in a linear fashion. And I would assume that that's important, especially based off of the story that gets told in this particular chapter. So they get on the boat, and everyone's kind of having a discussion about who's going to tell their next story, and there's talk of individuals trading numbers, and eventually Saul Weintraub, whose middle name starts with an M, so a lot of people call him M. Weintraub, he comes forward and says, I have the next number. And as we remember, Weintraub is the one who carries with him a small baby. Though that's kind of a redundant statement. Babies are usually intrinsically small. So he has a baby with him. And he begins to tell us his tale. Now, what we find out pretty quickly is that Weintraub is a scholar, specifically a Jewish scholar who works with like the hypotheticals of if God was real, kind of in a similar fashion to the way a lot of like philosophers during the 1700s wrote, like the deist philosophers would kind of have written in a similar fashion, because they wouldn't have necessarily believed that God was like an interactive God with the world, but if he were to interact, these are the ways in which he might. So he kind of works in like hermeneutics and things like that, kind of the hypothetical aspects of religion as a professor. And he and his wife, Shrike, which is just way too close to Sarah. As I mentioned before, Saul himself is Jewish. Saul is definitely a Jewish name, and there's a ton of symbolism associated with the spiritual journey of Saul, which is almost like mirrored in the way that Simmons portrays this particular story. So they conceive a daughter together, and it's their only child. They name the daughter Rachel, which is, of course, the favorite wife of, I want to say David, or it may have been Saul. I'm not totally sure, but it's the favorite wife of one of the main characters in the Old Testament. It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament because everyone forgets about the first part of it, where in Jewish tradition, you as a man would work off the dowry that was being paid to you for marrying someone's daughter. So you would live with your daughter-in-law's family while you worked off this dowry. And not that this is super pertinent to the story, I just think it's hilarious, and I find it important to educate people on what is actually in the Bible for some odd reason. Like, they're going to read it anyway. So he starts this tradition of working off the dowry because he wants to marry Rachel. Well, Rachel's dad says, like, yeah, sure, you can marry Rachel, just work for me for 7 years. So he works for 7 years and then is given one of the daughters, the two daughters that this guy has, in the middle of the night, and then he consummates the marriage with her, like, in some way that makes it so he can't see her face. And so when he wakes up the next morning, he finds out that it's Rachel's sister and not Rachel. And he's like, yo, dude, what the heck? Now I'm married to this girl because I had relations with her. This is a PG podcast, so I'm trying to keep it PG. But, and the dad says, oh, sorry, I thought you meant you wanted the other one, not this one. And so, he ends up having to work another 7 years. So he works 14 years. But in the meantime, of the 7 years that he's working to earn Rachel, I think he conceives at least one child with her sister. So just a funny little thing that a lot of people forget about is that that great love story we tell involves two wives, and they are sisters with each other. So it's kind of like that one, what's that show, Big Love? That really terrible reality show that deals with polygamy. Wow. Yeah. Anyway, should probably get back to the book. So all of the weird Jewish traditions and stories aside, there's a lot of symbolism that's happening in this particular chapter that involves like the Jewish faith and existential philosophy, which is pretty much to be expected. Because that's what Simmons has been harping on. Maybe not harping on, but he's been talking about it for the entirety of the book. So we're going to get more into that right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Before the break, we were talking about Saul Weintraub and his story in regards to like its importance and the symbolism and the references that are being made in this particular chapter to different ideas and other things. So the basic outline of the story is laid out for us pretty quickly. We find out that Rachel is an absolutely beloved daughter by both of her parents. They devote their entire lives to, being good parents and interacting with her, connecting with her, and she has kind of like a charmed life up until a certain point when she travels to, you guessed it, Hyperion. So it seems like what's really interesting is that a lot of the individuals in this book, pretty much anybody who lives on or has traveled to and left Hyperion has had a very negative experience in that regard. And Hyperion has kind of represented this like life-changing place where when you go there, you won't ever leave and be the same. And so we find out that Weintraub has never actually been to Hyperion, which is interesting because the Shrike Church are the ones who selected individuals for the pilgrimage to see the Shrike or to go to the Time Tombs one last time before the Ousters take over the planet, at least before they believe the Ousters take over the planet, based off of the way that the Shrike interacts with the world. I'm not entirely sure that anyone can take over that planet, but regardless, they sent these people there as the last pilgrimage because they don't know what's going to happen after that. So it's interesting that he is the first one who has not been to Hyperion, which I think is well, obviously it's intentional, but I think it's intentional in the specific regard that there's supposed to be some sort of symbolism as to this idea of like faith, though it is faith in like a horrendous giant metallic being known as the Lord of Pain. So that seems a little bit odd, maybe misplaced, but what we find out throughout the story is that a lot of what Simmons is kind of leveraging is material from a book called Fear and Trembling, which is, I don't know if you'd call it a book as much as like a long-form essay or something like that, by an individual named Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard is considered by many to be the father of existentialism, which is a pretty accurate statement, in my opinion. He does definitely do a good job. But Fear and Trembling specifically references like an attempt to reconcile the idea of the initial beginnings of the Abrahamic covenant between God and Abraham, and so the beginnings of Judaism in itself. So we'll get to that more later. I'd like to continue with Rachel's story, because a lot of Saul's story revolves around Rachel's story in the book. So Rachel goes to Hyperion as an archaeologist and is studying a particular aspect of the labyrinth and the Shrike time tomb / temples. And while she's there, she experiences this very odd phenomena where in the middle of the night, all of a sudden all of her instruments start freaking out, and it looks as if like the topography of the area that she's in is changing. The caverns feel as if they're closing in around her, and she's freaking out, and she can't escape, and then all of a sudden all the lights turn off. And Simmons definitely makes a point to remind us that this is the future, so things aren't supposed to break like that. She mentions specifically how many different fail-safe devices there would be in place to ensure that she would have light no matter what. But nothing is working. None of her instruments are working. None of her emergency lights are working. Even the flashlight on her hip won't work. And so she is stuck in the dark and begins to hear metallic scraping on the sides of the cavern in which she is. And she ends up passing out, and when she is found, they take her to a planet in the, I can't remember what it's called, but it's in the hegemony. So the hegemony is the primary governing body of the galaxy, and so they take her, the Hyperion is not in the hegemony, so they take her from Hyperion to a planet in the hegemony so that they can take care of her more, and so that her parents can come see her faster. And what they find out is that there's some sort of infection or sickness that has been inflicted upon Rachel that causes her to age Benjamin Button style backwards. But the catch is that she loses her memory from the day before. So she can only remember her life as if it was the first day of her being 23 years, like, for example, a birthday is a good way to put it, right? So if she wakes up on her 23rd birthday, she doesn't remember anything that's happened prior to or after when her 23rd birthday was in her life. So all of the memories, all of the interactions that she had, she can remember them as vividly as if they had happened literally the day before. But anything that had happened after her 23rd birthday, she no longer remembers. And just for reference, she got the disease when she was 32. So if she's at her 23rd birthday, she no longer has any memory of years 23 through 32, and she only remembers ages 0 up to 23. And then every day that she, ages more and goes backwards more, she remembers only up to that day, if that makes sense. And so this is, of course, devastating for the family, for Weintraub and his wife. And they kind of take a 50 first dates approach to the situation at first, where they are trying to basically reorient Rachel every day by making her watch a tape of herself saying, hey, this is weird, and this is what's going on, and it sucks, and you're going to be okay, and, this type of stuff is what's happening. And eventually, she decides that she's not going to do that anymore. She tells her father, like, I just don't want to know anymore that this is what's happening to me. I just want to live as if I am, like, this is the first day of my 16th birthday. I'm not going to remember anything after this. And so part of the reason I'm bringing up birthdays is because that's an important point in time for her. She makes that delineation several times of, like, and Simmons really. Simmons makes a point to talk about her birthdays as being important landmarks of specific aspects of adulthood leaving her. And so she, on her 21st birthday, says, I don't want to know anymore. Just let me live as if I am 21, or I'm 20 and 364 days old. And, like, don't tell me what's going on for real. Just lie to me. And so they start to do that. And yes, I know what you're thinking. The baby that Weintraub has is Rachel. I'm just going to throw that out there because we know, pretty quickly, as soon as you find out the ailment that has befallen Rachel, and you also know that the baby's name is Rachel from the start. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that it's the same person. So I don't really feel like I'm spoiling much for anybody there. So we're going to keep talking about this and get a little bit more into detail about what this has to do with Kierkegaard and why I even brought that guy's name up. Right after a quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
individuals contributing to this podcast. It's just me. So I was talking about the condition that Rachel has been inflicted with, where she ages backwards, and we were kind of getting to the point of why it is that I feel that Simmons is referencing Kierkegaard in this, and the time at which Rachel is inflicted with this disease, I guess you could call it a disease in quotes. Like the doctors call it Merlin's disease, which is a reference that I feel like I should understand, but I don't quite. You'd think that he may have I don't know, if the Odd Life of Benjamin Button. I feel like that's a really old story, so I don't think, I think it could have been around for him to reference. So anyway, so they call it Merlin syndrome. It's not really a disease necessarily, but it is something like, apparently there are aging diseases in this galaxy, so there were aging disease specialists that tried to like come cure Rachel, but there is no cure. They can't. It's not like she's irradiated or there's a therapy or anything like that that can prevent this from happening to her. It's kind of like she exists in this weird little bubble of time where it moves backwards and there's nothing that anybody can do about it, which is just really unfortunate, obviously. But the night that Rachel is injured in the accident on Hyperion, Saul Weintraub has a dream where a loud voice tells him, "Take your only daughter, whom you love, to the planet Hyperion and offer her as a burnt sacrifice to me at a place that I will reveal to you." And this is pretty much a direct quote from the Old Testament. It's the statement that was made to Abraham when God gave him, or after God gave him and Sarah a son. So if you're not super familiar with this story, basically Abraham and Sarah really wanted to have a baby and really wanted to have a son because a son was super important to them. I don't remember exactly why. Obviously, patriarchal reasons and things like that, what have you. Not necessarily super important, at least not in this context. So they really want to have a son. They pray to all these different gods, and eventually they pray to the God of the Bible. And he says, "Yeah, I'll give you a son. Just be patient." And so they wait and they wait and they wait. And Sarah's like, I think almost 100 years old. And finally, God says, "You're going to have a baby." And they're like, "No, she's way too old." But she does. And she carries a son, or she gives birth to a son named Isaac. And then after Isaac grows up a little bit and Abraham gets nice and attached and loves the crap out of him, God decides that he's going to tell Abraham, "Hey, by the way, if you want this covenant with me, you have to be willing to sacrifice the thing that you love the most, and that is your son. You have to be willing to take him to a mountain that I tell you to take him to, and then basically put him on the altar and stab him and let him, and he's going to be an offering to me, even though I, blessed you with him." So what Kierkegaard does is basically say, there's an issue with this idea. What kind of God would order such a thing, or would decide that such a thing was necessary in order to test an individual's willingness? Especially since, we're not even getting into the idea of whether or not ontologically we have free will or if things are determined and what have you, but we're just going to assume for the sake of the argument that we do have free will and that God knows what it is that we'll choose, but still in some capacity can be surprised. I'm not totally sure exactly how I want to handle that wording. That's all sorts of muddy waters there. Regardless, it's not important for what Kierkegaard is trying to say. What Kierkegaard is trying to say is, like, what kind of a God would do this, and is that God still good? And that is kind of what we're looking at in this particular arena with Saul and his daughter. And there is a lot of symbolism and allusion to Jewish thought and to the Old Testament in this chapter. I mean, Saul, Sarai, eventually the family relocates to New Hebron, or to Hebron, which is basically the place where the Jewish people have gone, the same way that the Palestinians went to Mars. The Jewish people have gone to Hebron, and are trying to kind of like eke out an existence there that's a little bit closer to what they're used to religiously. And so it's really interesting that Simmons invokes this particular passage from the Bible, because it is the same passage from the Bible that Kierkegaard spends tons and tons of time on in the book Fear and Trembling and in numerous of his other works. Kierkegaard was a pretty prolific writer and a very, I guess you would say, tortured soul. He did not have a great life, which is interesting because it kind of seems like Saul has the opposite of that, where he has a great life up until he has this dream and doesn't do anything about it. And then after the dream, it seems like a lot of the things in his life start to go south. He, towards the end of his daughter's time as a conscious individual, I think she's like 5 or 6, his wife actually dies in a random car accident. And so that's pretty devastating, obviously, because they've been married for, 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 years. They've been married for a very long time. And so she dies in this horrible accident, and it really, messes up his ability to take care of his daughter and to do anything else. So he ends up even more so dedicating his life to taking care of his daughter, which I think in some capacity is yet another reference to Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard, if I remember correctly, ends up taking care of his wife because she is very ill. And one thing I definitely want to mention about this chapter is that it is written just impeccably. A lot of the chapters in this book so far have really relied on like tension or a twist or something like that to kind of like solicit more meaning out of them. This particular chapter is profoundly sentimental. There are these small little subtle details that Simmons uses to portray specific aspects of the relationship between Weintraub and his daughter that are just so powerful and so small that you kind of think of them as being benign, but ultimately they're very sentimental. And so as we see her grow younger and they lose this ability to like communicate in certain capacities, it just becomes even more devastating to watch him go through all of that, because we are so, abundantly familiar with the bonds between the two of them, and we kind of are like rooting. He writes it in a way to where you're rooting for them by the end of the whole situation. But anyway, that's kind of neither here nor there. So we are finally going to start covering some of what it is that Kierkegaard says in Fear and Trembling, and what that has to do with the ideas of Simmons in this chapter of Hyperion. But that'll be right after this next quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
I was just singing the praises of Dan Simmons and talking about how much I loved this particular chapter of the book. But really, what we have all been waiting for to talk about this whole time has been Kierkegaard. I mentioned him at the top of the podcast as being a very important part of this chapter. And just to emphasize that importance, which I think is really funny, when I Googled him before the podcast, just to kind of like give myself a little bit of a refresher on the specific work that's being referenced in this particular chapter, there was a quote from Kierkegaard that said, life is best understood backwards, but can only be lived forwards. So, not that I think that many authors are going to take a quote and then be like, oh, actually, what if we could do it the other way around? And like run with it the way that Simmons has. And I don't want to say that that quote is the reason or the inspiration necessarily for the chapter, but it does seem pretty on the nose for what is going on in this particular chapter and the way in which Simmons is handling this particular subject matter. It does seem pretty obvious that, well, and the fact that he mentions Kierkegaard by name, I would assume that he would be familiar with this quote, though probably not from a Google search. It's much more likely that he's familiar with the quote from the book that the quote is from, which if I had to wager a guess is probably Fear and Trembling. Fear and Trembling is, as I mentioned earlier, a book by Soren Kierkegaard that specifically comments on what kind of God is the Judeo-Christian God if he would, as one of his first acts of, questioning, or as one of his first desires for service from an individual, was to tell that individual to take the son that he had blessed him with and take him up to a mountain, which is like a 3-day hike, I think is what it was called, or what it ended up being, a 3-day hike up a mountain to kill his son on an altar, which is basically just, murder in some capacity. And what kind of God would do that? And is that God good? And it's been a little while since I've had a discussion on this particular topic, but it's pretty obvious that this is what Simmons is kind of trying to wrestle with in this particular chapter, though I think that the answer is a little bit more obvious to us as readers in this particular case because there's kind of like an ailment that's introduced as one of the aspects of this particular questioning of certain things, because the Shrike is definitely not representative of like a similar, or at least it's not perceived as like a similarly benign force like God. Like the Judeo-Christian God normally is considered to be like a generally benign force, like it's good. I think that's the right way to use benign. Altruistic, generally a good being. And so the difference between the Shrike and, God is that the Shrike is more obviously evil, whereas like if you were to look at the way that people interpret the Christian God, you would have to look a little bit harder. Not that much harder. You just have to be a little bit more mindful about your interpretation of the Bible in order to solicit the same conclusions that you can about the Shrike. Because what's interesting, and this is something that like I feel like Simmons has been dancing around the entire time with this particular book, is that the Shrike is portrayed as being, the God of pain and punishment. And in the Bible, there is plenty of occurrence of pain and punishment, especially mainly in the Old Testament. Now, I don't know if Simmons is of the Judaic faith, but it does seem interesting to me that so far every religious system that has been mentioned, which has been in some capacity, we've had Catholicism, we've had the Muslim faith, we've had like an atheism or a Zen Buddhism, and we've had Judaism now. I don't know what the next one will be. I had to guess because it's an investigator. I would guess it's going to be kind of like the deistic view. It seems to me that something that Simmons might be trying to do is turn the Shrike into like this Messiah-like figure where ultimately he unifies all of the religious views of these different sects or types of religion, because the Catholic priest experiences the Shrike in the like form of something that is resurrected, and that's the biggest thing about the Messiah for the Catholic faith, is that it's resurrected, is that Jesus is resurrected. So the resurrection of the gosh darn it, what were those things called? I can't even remember. It's been so long. I'll remember it later. But the resurrection of the native peoples who are of the seven score and nine, or 7 score and 6, or something like that. 7 and 7. I think it was 77 was the number. I can't even remember that apparently. Regardless, that tribe is resurrected, and so that interaction is specifically Catholic. And then we've got the Muslim individual who the way that God interacts with him is kind of a little bit more towards like definitely a westernized understanding of Islam or the Muslim faith for sure. With a kind of like a violence, but also like a specific type of distance that's present in the general theology of that faith is also present. And then we get an interaction in like a Zen Buddhist way, where kind of in Zen Buddhism or in Buddhism in general, part of the point is that like you kind of build God yourself in some capacity. I think in Zen Buddhism, ultimately you decide that you are God. And so when Silenus is the one who is like blamed for actualizing the Shrike in some capacity, then he is becoming a god in some way because he's interacting with the world in a way where his language actualizes things, which is godlike. And then we get this interaction in a Judeo fashion, or a Judaistic Judaism, I don't know, a Jewish, whatever. I'm trying to make it sound more complicated than it actually is. We get it in a Jewish fashion in this most recent chapter, in the sense that, like, even Simmons specifically mentions, like, there's this dialogue that happens between, gosh darn it, why can't I remember his name? Weintraub. That happens between Weintraub and God, and that it's kind of like this secret dialogue that he has at first, where he is, like, acting in a way where he's like secretly talking to God and secretly being angry at God, and then eventually starts like shouting at the sky. And he says that is a specific aspect of the Jewish faith that is perpetuated into the future by these individuals who are still practicing Jews. And now Weintraub is one of them, but instead of kind of talking to God, he feels that he's talking to the Shrike in some capacity, which, again, the Shrike, being known as like the god of pain or the god of torture, is not really all that different from just kind of an alternative interpretation of the God of the Old Testament, especially. Because it's not as if there aren't plenty of stories in the Old Testament where the Jewish people are commanded by God to smite and destroy and slaughter other entire civilizations. And even in the New Testament, there are multiple instances where, specifically in Acts, individuals violate the laws of God and are instantly killed. Now, it's not usually violently, it's usually very instantaneous, like the earth swallowed them, or things along those lines. And that is decidedly different than being flayed alive by a giant metal organism. But I still think that it's kind of important to note that it feels like Simmons is kind of trying to get us to draw this conclusion that, like, hey, maybe these religious systems that all can relate in some capacity to this ultra-violent, uncaring, just objectively evil creature, it rules over all of us. Maybe the fact that all of them can relate to this is not a good thing. And I think that that's probably one of Simmons' main points of commentary, is on the idea of religion itself, which I find to be very interesting. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about this, try to focus a little bit more on the ideas of Kierkegaard in reference to this particular chapter right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
I was talking about maybe some of Simmons' commentary on like theology and God during this chapter with Weintraub, and the primary dialogue that seems to be happening between Weintraub and God, quote unquote, which in this particular case is pretty definitively the Shrike, is, this dialogue of how could you possibly do this particular thing to my daughter, and like why would you do that, and just kind of asking the question of like why is it that things are the way that they are, which is like kind of a really simple question with like an incredibly complex answer, because just saying the phrase like why are things the way that they are is ultimately just like a woefully inept way of trying to figure out like the purpose of things. And so part of the journey that Weintraub goes on is to try and find the purpose of why it is that his daughter's been afflicted with this disease. So he does go to talk to like the Shrike priests, who really are not thrilled to talk to him. They think of his daughter as being both the most blessed and cursed individual in the entire universe. So when he basically describes the ailment that she's experiencing, they say like, oh, everybody's going to go through this ailment at some point, because part of what they believe as far as like their religion that follows the Shrike is concerned is that humanity as a whole is living on borrowed time. And so at some point their time will be up. And if I had to guess, it's kind of like a singularity type event where like the borrowed time reaches a certain point and is equivalent to the amount of time at which they should have died ago, and then things will kind of like come to a head then. And that's probably part of what is happening with what's happening on Hyperion in this particular instance for the pilgrimage and things like that. But the Shrike seems to be able to interact with people across the galaxy and not just on Hyperion. So I have a feeling that there's a lot more to this particular thing than just the planet Hyperion or just the individuals on the pilgrimage. I have a feeling that there's going to be far more wide-sweeping consequences to whatever happens in this particular journey. And part of the reason that I say that is because, again, the religion who worships the Shrike believes that the Shrike exists as some form of punishment to the human race, or the human species, rather. Race is not a good way to qualify that. We are a species of animal. But the Shrike exists to like punish or solicit atonement from individuals within our species for the actions that they have committed. Specifically for the destruction of old Earth is one of the big reasons that they think that we would be, quote unquote, punished by the Shrike. And I think that is kind of like another reason why I would say that this chapter is heavily focusing on like this idea of Jewish values or a Judeo or Jewish archaeology. I don't know why I keep trying to say Judeo. It's not working for me. I just need to give up on it. But no, Jewish, like a Jewish history, because oftentimes if you look at the figures in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of why, oh, why God, why me, why us, why this particular time, why this particular thing. And so this dialogue that's been happening since the very beginning of recorded time for an individual who, believes in the Jewish faith is still perpetuating into Saul Weintraub's current existence in this book, which is, I want to say it's thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions of years later. And he is just kind of realizing, like, there's nothing that's really changed and there's nothing new under the sun. And I think it's interesting that Simmons talks so much about the ideas of Soren Kierkegaard in this particular chapter, because Kierkegaard is not a Jewish philosopher. He's a Catholic or a Christian guy. And one of, like, the kind of the conclusions that you can draw about the book that he wrote, Fear and Trembling, one of the primary critiques or conclusions that is drawn is that there's a certain point at which you have to reach like a quotient of willingness in order to achieve true faith. And that quotient of willingness comes from a certain level of desperation or resignment. And this kind of like leads into the ideas of Nietzsche and the ressentiment, and where you kind of like end up in this place where you have resigned yourself to certain things happening to you, and you are either, holding a bitterness or finding a meaning in them, depending on, where you are at in your particular journey. But regardless, the fact that he would invoke this story or this philosophy that Kierkegaard had, to me, says that he is really trying to say that, like, something about the Shrike is absolutely godlike in that it expects sacrifice, and the interactions it has with the world are like decidedly different from the interactions that other organisms and things have with the world, especially when it comes to the pilgrims, because the Shrike is the one like unifying factor between all of them. But it also seems to be a unifying factor between all of their religious beliefs, which I find to be like incredibly interesting, because that's what one of the main like requirements of a Messiah is that it's like a unifying figure that brings all of these belief systems together in a way that allows for some semblance of harmony. And we're kind of getting that with the Shrike, but we're getting it in a way that is very dissonant, because the Shrike is a violent and destructive figure and not a figure of like banality. No, not banality. A figure of benevolence. It is a figure that, destroys things and tortures individuals and kills them slowly. As I mentioned, he was not kind to Sad King Billy in the story that Silenus told. So we are definitely kind of led to believe as readers that I think Simmons is really trying to hammer it home that he doesn't really interpret religion as a viable way to understand the universe around us, or to understand why things are the way that they are, because ultimately the meaning that we draw from things doesn't really hold much clout if the thing that you're trying to draw meaning from is ultimately controlled by some unseen force that doesn't act with your best interest in mind. And one of the things that we kind of find out towards the end of the chapter is that at least we think we find it out. We don't really know exactly what is real and what is not real as far as Weintraub's experience is. But one of the things that we find out happened to him is that he had another dream where Rachel was in the dream with him, and she was conscious of what was going on. And there is some sort of kind of like unspoken hush over the room after he tells his story, where everyone kind of feels like Rachel might actually be cognizant of what is going on in the room with her in some capacity. Because the final exchange that Weintraub has with the Shrike before he gets to go on this pilgrimage is very interesting, and I will talk about it right after this last commercial break.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Idea that the Shrike is representative of like a messiah type figure that is unifying across multiple versions or iterations of religious belief, and that in some capacity the actions and the interactions that the individuals on this pilgrimage will have larger ramifications on the human species as a whole, because for some odd reason, I am in part bought in on the idea of the Church of the Shrike, which I think is hilarious that Simmons is kind of able to, evangelize as an author, evangelize his readers to believing in the ideas of the Shrike, because between the stories that everyone has told, it just seems so blatantly obvious to me that there is some sort of like just supernatural power that exists within the Shrike, and it's not just this like scientifically categorized version of time, that that the experience of time or the idea of time, the importance of the numbers, everything that is involved with the Shrike to me has some form of like at least quasi sanctity, which I have found to be, I don't know, just very indicative of the fact that the Shrike is in some capacity, maybe not omnipotent, but at least mostly omnipotent, which, I don't know. There's this idea of like religious beliefs where, is God sufficiently powerful or sufficiently good, but not necessarily omnipotent or omnibenevolent. And so Simmons might be trying to kind of propose like that type of interaction. It seems to me that there is just a lot of religious commentary in this particular book, especially in this last chapter. Now, when you're looking at Kierkegaard's work, just to kind of like bookend the discussion with this particular point, when you're looking at Kierkegaard's work and if you decide to read Fear and Trembling, which I do recommend that you do, one of the conclusions that he comes to is that God isn't necessarily good in the capacity that we would, as humans, believe to be good. He isn't even necessarily good in the capacity of the laws that he outlines humans to follow, but he is exempt from those particular things because, it is exempt from those particular things because that's kind of like if a computer made or we make rules for a computer, we don't have to follow the rules that we made for that computer. We exist outside of those rules. God is kind of like, in some capacity similar. And that's kind of one of Kierkegaard's conclusions. And so I think that might also be part of like why there's this struggle to interpret what it is that the Shrike is by the members of this pilgrimage, because they're kind of thinking to themselves like, well, people view this Shrike, the Shrike figure as being like a god in some capacity, or that it's a violent god and things like that. But like ultimately, I think that there is some sort of benevolence to the Shrike in some capacity that we're going to find out. And that part of Simmons' intention when he goes to describe interactions with the Shrike is to kind of subtly convince us that it is not, that it completely lacks any goodness within it. But like, I think that it kind of serves like a monkey's paw function in that oftentimes you'll kind of get what you want from it in some capacity, but it's not in the way that you would have hoped to have gotten it. And so now we're kind of viewing it as this evil thing, but ultimately it's given you something that you didn't, you wouldn't have had otherwise. And that like that thing that you wanted otherwise could be something that was really good for you or what have you. But I had kind of mentioned that at the end of the chapter, we get this indication that Rachel is somewhat cognizant of what's going on, at least if we are to believe Weintraub's statement of the fact that she visited him in the most recent dream that he had about the Shrike, telling him to take his daughter to a place that it has designated, and to sacrifice her. And so his willingness to do that, we think, is maybe part of the cure of it. And, that's the Shrike demanding some form, maybe not of sacrifice, but of servanthood. I'm not exactly sure how to interpret this particular part of the story, because it's the first time that the Shrike has seemed to really embody a specific aspect of God other than like one that involves like the control over the ideas of language, or one that involves like an inevitability, or one that involves immortality. Like all those other aspects of godliness are a little bit more ambiguous, but for it to demand the same thing that like God in the Jewish faith demands, kind of really is the first time that we get this differentiation between, like this is just a very powerful being to like this could be God. And so I think that that's part of Simmons' commentary is like, what do we really think that the Shrike is, and is Simmons trying to say that eventually we will find God somewhere in the universe in some capacity? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. Regardless, I think that it's very interesting, and I really enjoyed this chapter. I cannot emphasize how much I really do recommend this book. It's pretty incredible. There's just a lot to it. And so after Weintraub tells his story, we get a little bit of like a brief respite at the end of the chapter, where everyone is kind of like, oh, I'm going to go up on deck because that was just intense. And I realized that there's like a little baby in here that used to be a 32-year-old woman that Saul is taking to kill as a burnt offering at a place that's been determined by the Shrike, which is just a little bit creepy, And so they go up on deck, and what they find is that there's actually a space battle going on. And the large ship that they were brought here on, called the Idrisil, which is like this living tree that can travel in space. I don't exactly know. Simmons doesn't really explain a ton of it, but I'm sure that, it'll be explained in the sequels or later on in this book if it's important, that there is kind of something that happened that was really discouraging at the beginning of the next chapter, but we'll get to that next week. Regardless, the Idrisil is blown up by Ouster scouting ships, which is a big deal because that is like the progenitor ship. It's like a very important kind of like religious relic of, or religious symbol of one of the characters, Headmastine, who is actually the person who is next in the pecking order of who tells their tales. So very interesting that the ship gets destroyed immediately before Headmastine begins to, or just is going to tell his story. So I am really interested to see what happens next. I've really enjoyed this book so far. I enjoy talking about it every Sunday. Sometimes it's hard to not just keep listening to it and also talk about it on Wednesday. But I'm hoping to do like a book review or something along those lines on the book Sirens of Titan, I think is what it's called. It's a Kurt Vonnegut book. So I don't know if we're going to kind of start like a double book club thing here where I'm doing a book on Wednesday and a different book on Sunday. Could potentially do that. As far as science fiction content is concerned, there's a lot on TV, but there's not nearly as much good stuff on TV as there is good stuff written down in books. So I have a hard time picking television series and things like that that can provide substantial discussion over the course of an hour. So that about does it for today. If you are reading the book along with me, please feel free to leave anything in the comments. Follow us on Twitter, add us on Twitter, all of that great stuff. I am definitely interested in hearing your thoughts and engaging with you guys in any capacity that I can. So definitely feel free to do that. Leave us a review. Preferably it'll be 5 stars and what have you. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. Hope you're staying safe out there. And yeah, we'll talk to you later.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.